Yo, what's good, everybody? Today, what we're going to do is go over the modern metagame and see just how shaken up everything was by all of the bans and the Cascade rules changes. So, for anybody new to this channel, my name is Dre, and I'm here to help everybody sort out what to expect as far as modern's concerned. So, the first thing that we're going to address is some of the cards that were recently banned, and those, of course, are going to include Tybalt Cosmic Imposter, Simian Spirit Guide, and Public Enemy Numero Uro.
How you bore me? I'm right.
Bad joke aside, all three of these cards were relatively toxic as far as the metagame's concerned, so what we're going to do, just like Wizards did, is delete all of these literally from the picture, and we're just going to open up the meta and see exactly what's going on. So, to recap, for anybody who doesn't know yet, there is an actual ban list update that took place this week. So, Field of Dead, Mystic Sanctuary, Simian Spirit Guide, Tybalt's Trickery, and Uro himself are no longer allowed in Modern. These mean changes for a lot of decks. Both of the top two decks were playing some of the banned cards, so the Uro Omnath, of course, playing namesake Uro, and Valky Cascade was playing Cascade things. There's also another variant of Sultai Uro here, but we'll still see that this is only 3 of the top decks. There are still plenty of other viable top tier options, including my personal favorite, Spirits. There's also going to be a whole nother page on the metagame here, so we're going to get to check that out. And here we'll see another Uro variant, but also decks like Ad Nauseam, Amulet Titan, Valky Cascade, but Jund with a bunch of Blood Moons, Oops All Spells, Electro Balance, and Charbelcher. All of those have also lost cards, so we are looking at a pretty well shaken up metagame here. So it's going to be our job to sort out exactly what decks are left and what decks were kind of unlocked by some of these best cards being banned. And the way to do that is going to be a tier list. As always, we're going to go ahead and sort things into tiers, where the best decks are going to be labeled as S tier decks. These are the decks that are just far and away the most powerful things to be doing at any given point in time, all the way down to C tier, and below that, non-foil Jund, because ew. And we've gone ahead and assembled some lovely graphics to represent a lot of the archetypes. So we'll see the card Ad Nauseam, for example, will represent Ad Nauseam, Blood Moon will represent Ponza, stuff like that. So let's go ahead and get right into it. The first deck, of course, has lost a huge chunk of its combo, and that's going to be Ad Nauseam. So this deck no longer has the option to triple Simian Spirit Guide into a Lightning Storm for 100 million damage. Instead, they have two options. Either Ad Nauseam is going to have to rely on Thassa's Oracle's Spoils of the Vault to get its wins that way, or they're going to have to find a secondary combo altogether. Whether it's going to be something based on Inverter of Truth or something else, we'll simply find out. But for now, this is something that these pilots will have to figure out. And until they do figure it out, I think I'm actually going to put them in C tier. They're not going to go all the way down here, because Thassa's Oracle and Spoils of the Vault is already a combo they're playing, and it's already efficient. So I don't think this deck is out of game, but they should probably step it up and find another combo, or another way to make it more resilient. Our next deck here is going to be traditional Red-White Burn. So this is going to be Eidolon and the Great Revel and Friends, and we've already seen that Burn is performing pretty well. With a bunch of these combo decks slowing down, a lot of games are going to be more likely to want to go into turns 4 and 5, and that's exactly where a deck like Burn will thrive. So I'm actually going to stick Burn all the way up in A tier, and it probably won't be at the top of A tier by the time I'm done, but it's a really solid deck. Our next deck is going to be Black-Red Midrange, represented by Croxa. So Black-Red Midrange is a deck that did get to see a decent amount of play in last season, but it didn't lose anything, and a bunch of decks that would otherwise outvalue it did. And for that reason, I'm actually going to stick Black-Red Midrange into B tier, because while the threats are not the best in Modern by any means, Blood Moon will steal these guys some games. So I'm kind of looking forward to seeing this deck regrow its legs. Our next deck here is going to be Death and Taxes. Now, Death and Taxes is a deck that has the ability to just adjust its core strategy by 2 or 3 cards to really fight whatever's going on at any point in time. And I like that kind of deck. I mean, I've been playing it for years, you know. But I do think that Death and Taxes is one of those decks that will definitely be a solid A tier spot, above Burn actually. And most of the reason for me putting it so high, at least for now, is going to be because a lot of the slower decks that rely more on their lands to do things are A, going to open themselves up to Death and Taxes by simply existing in a metagame again, like Tron, or B, trying to function without the ability to do things with Field of the Dead, and that's where the Primeval Titan piles are going to come in. Death and Taxes, I think, are going to get some percentage points against both of those, so it's going to be a really, really great thing to just watch these decks function and do their thing. So Death and Taxes is one that I'm looking forward to just watching just kill a crap ton of people. It's going to be really fun again. Next is going to be our first S tier deck, and this is going to be Black-Red Death Shadow. Now, the streamlined version of Black-Red has been the best one of the Death Shadows deck in Modern for quite some time, and I do still think that is going to be the case. So there are other variants of Death Shadow decks like Grixis, Jund, even Esper rolling around. There's like 4-color decks with Traverse the Ulvenwald. I think all of those versions of the deck are much clunkier than the very streamlined Red-Black Death Shadow deck. I think this deck is great, and all the other versions of Death Shadow, minus potentially Grixis with Stubborn Denial, are pretty bad right now. So the next deck we're going to see is Delver of Secrets, and these are just going to be your blue-red, sometimes splashing a 3rd color Delver piles. And these decks did get to see and enjoy a little bit of popularity with the Tibalt decks, but I think that time has passed for this deck to be relevant. And unfortunately, I am putting Delver of Secrets into the non-foiled Jund category. It's got a certain time and a place, and this is really neither the time or place. So, thanks to Valky/Tibalt being gone, and Prowess playing Lava Dart, getting your 1/1 to untap reliably when you don't have cards like Brainstorm, I don't think that's where I would want to, sign up for a tournament with that as my primary threat. Like, it's just not a great place to be right now. Next is going to be a deck that hasn't seen A tier listing in some time, and that's going to be Dredge. So Dredge, I think, is in a great place right now. It was already doing a great amount of winning before Kaldheim came out, and there's really nothing to suggest that it can't still do that same amount of winning. So I'm actually going to stick it all the way up in A tier, and I'm going to stick it above Death and Taxes. Dredge is a deck that needs to be respected. It is almost solely the reason why a lot of decks have between 3 and 6 graveyard hate cards in their graveyards to this day. And I think that it may actually find a way to get overlooked yet again. But it will let people know, and it will be respected. So that's where I'm going to put Dredge for right now. Next up is going to be the Aledom Call version of Primeval Titan decks. And the Aledom Call version of this deck, without Field of the Dead to cement its endgame, I think that this deck finds itself in a little bit of an awkward place, because it is slower than Scapeshift, it is slower than Amulet Titan, but it doesn't have the strengthened endgame that it had over those two anymore now that Field of the Dead is no longer an option. So I think this deck kind of finds itself in limbo, and unless it gets a fantastic builder to work around it, or just another tool, I think it's actually going to be pretty bad, because people are already going to be prepared for Amulet Titan, people are already going to be prepared for Scapeshift, and I think right now, without Field of the Dead, Aledom Call is just a weaker version of both of those decks right now. So our next deck here is going to be Eldrazi Tron, and I'm actually predicting that this deck makes a little bit of a comeback. I don't think it's going to be fantastic by any means, but I do think that Chalice of the Void on 1 is going to end up bodying a lot of these decks that are really just trying to be hyper proactive and low to the ground. So I'm actually going to stick not necessarily Eldrazi Tron, but Chalice of the Void, all the way up here in B tier. Just based on the strength of that card's ability to lock out decks like Prowess and Friends. And, ooh, our next deck is going to be Other Tron. So this is Mono Green. And Mono Green Tron, I believe, is going to be, I guess, unlocked because, honestly, when Valky Tibalt was a thing, Tron was essentially locked out of existence. Like, there was no reason to play a 7-mana Karn for 3 mana when you can instead play a 7-mana Tibalt for 1. Like, why would you play Tron? But now you can. And whether I believe this deck is good or not, it will see a lot of play in your leagues. So make sure you're ready for that. But I do think Tron is going to be right around here. It's going to be about the middle of the pack B tier deck. And that's just still based off of the strength of having, 1-2 Tron as your turn sequences. That is still going to get a lot of people dead, but I don't believe the deck is actually in a very strong place anymore. Next up is going to be Goblins. So Goblins is in a very unfortunately awkward place right now. And even though it's got the ability to combo, and tribal decks are actually pretty decent right now thanks to all of their disruption, I think Goblins is the worst of the bunch, even though it's the only one with a truly infinite combo. So the problems that Goblin has is that people are already prepared to deal with Aether Vial thanks to Spirits doing well last month, and all the creatures are fragile enough to still die to things like Ren and 6 on their own. And for that reason, unfortunately, I am going to put I'm going to put Goblins right along with Delver in the non-foil Jund category. Ooh, next up is going to be Goblin Charbelcher. So, Belcher did lose Simian Spirit Guide, so that's going to be something that we need to be aware of. But I think instead of Simian Spirit Guide, this deck can just get away with playing 2 mana rocks, and it'll probably still be fine. It won't be anywhere near as good because it'll be a whole turn, sometimes 2 slower, but realistically, the deck shouldn't have had the option to kill it on turn 2 as often as it did anyway, so I think I'm okay with that. But I think the fact that people are both already aware of it and it's slower are gonna be reasons to stick it all the way in C tier. So I think it'll live somewhere near the top of C tier because unlike Ad Nauseam, it didn't lose its whole combo or anything. It just has the same cards and it's a turn slower. But that turn matters a lot. So next up is going to be Ponza. And Ponza, I think, is going to end up being one of the big winners from this recent set of bannings. Now, by big winner, I don't mean that it's going to catapult up to tier S or anything like that. But I do think that the deck is going to go from basically being non-existent all the way up here somewhere in the middle of B tier. So it is definitely a better Blood Moon deck than Red-Black mid-range is, but I think the threats in Ponza are worse than the threats in Black-Red. With that said, Blood Moon is much better in Ponza than it is in Black-Red mid-range, and I think that will cement it in a slightly higher place than Black-Red mid-range because Blood Moon is strong enough to warrant that piece of conversation all on its own. Oh, next is going to be Hammer Time. So Hammer Time is a deck that is fast enough to win on turn 2, and it had some game against the Tibalt decks, but it didn't actually lose anything, y'all. I think Hammer Time is going to be really insane. So this is going to be a deck that we've already talked about before, honestly quite a bit, and it did a lot of winning last season. It did even more the season before that. And I think it's going to live all the way at the top of A tier. Hammer Time is a deck that needs respecting. Ooh. So next is going to be Hardened Scales. Here's a deck I haven't seen in a little while. So Hardened Scales is actually pretty good. The problem with Hardened Scales is still that Hammer Time exists. And Honestly, I don't believe that many builders are going to put all of the work that is required to make Hardened Scales good into actually building Hardened Scales with it. I think those players who would otherwise put time into Hardened Scales are just going to spend that same amount of time playing Hammer Time. And unfortunately for that reason, I do think that this deck is going to live somewhere in like the top half of C tier, because it has potential. Like, it can definitely win some games, and it's incredibly resilient, but I don't think there's an optimum build out for it. And until some modern aficionados get their hands on it and want to play it more than they want to play Hammer Time, I don't really see that changing anytime soon. So I hope I'm wrong, because I do like the deck, but I don't like it enough to switch from Spirits to playing it myself. So we'll just have to see what happens here. Alright, so our next deck is going to be Heliocombo. And I think I do like Heliocombo quite a bit. So, as always, Infinite Life is completely nuts. It's Infinite Life. And so many decks don't have the ability to beat main deck Auriok champions. And I do think that both of those reasons are good enough to have it continue to be a good, solid, top tier choice. So I think Heliocombo is going to live in A tier, right below Hammer Time for now. So the Collected Company being able to assemble the entire combo by itself is going to be pretty good. But its non-combo game is still relatively weak to a lot of decks. So like, you know, if you're just trying to attack with Conclave Mentor and friends, honestly the deck's not that good at that. But I do think it's good enough as a combo deck to be worth an A tier spot still. So our next deck here is going to be Humans. So Humans is a deck that really thrived in a combo-based meta, but I believe that time is over. I think Humans is not really the deck you would want to play in a world of both Lava Dart and mid-range decks. And while it did have its day in the sun, I do think Humans is going to be a bottom of the pack B tier deck. It can definitely steal some wins, but I think its time has come and gone. Next up is going to be Infect. So Infect is going to be a deck that always has some decent amount of legs, but I think it suffers from the same problems that Humans have, while having none of the end game that Humans can at least try to assemble sometimes. Like, if you assemble like one Ren and 6 against Infect, a lot of the times that's just kind of a handshake. Sometimes you'll get lucky and you'll have leftover mana and your opponent won't participate and you'll get to kill him on turn 2. But again, in a world of gut shots and lava darts, I don't really see that happening. And until prowess leaves the metagame, I think Infect is going to be all the way somewhere in C tier, actually below Hardened Scales, because it's much less resilient than that deck. And next is going to be everybody's favorite boomer deck, Jund. So if your deck is non-foil and you're playing Jund, it goes here. But we all know that nobody plays non-foil Jund, so it's going to get an actual analysis here. I do think Jund is not going to be like one of those decks to play, but I think it has almost restored its status upon itself as a 50-50 deck, which is kind of exactly where Jund players want to be. So I do think that Jund is actually going to live right... Nope. Switch. There we go. It's going to be somewhere under Tron and above Ponza, but solidly in the top half of B tier. So Red-Black no longer stealing the spot from Tarmogoyf. Tarmogoyf can see play again. I think that Jund actually will have some legs again. So just having the ability to go, you know, 1-drop discard spell, 2-drop removal or Tarmogoyf, 3-drop Liliana, that's still going to be a really powerful line that the Jund deck has access to. And I actually see that being relevant again, where the last couple of formats, nobody cared if you went Tarmogoyf into Liliana. So next on our list here is going to be Merfolk. And Merfolk is always a deck that I believe has legs. Mostly because I like tribal nonsense, and I play tribal nonsense. I think Merfolk has a lot of game when the combo of format is either combo or blue, and I think the format is moving away from both of those directions. So while it definitely has some very strong aggro plans of just, pumping out four lords and killing people, I don't really know if you want to be playing merfolk in a field of just like lightning bolts and fatal pushes and prowess decks, and for that reason I'm actually going to stick it all the way into C tier, but it's going to live at the top of C tier because I definitely think it's got a lot more legs than all of these decks, but I don't think it's as good as either of these decks. So our next deck here is going to be Mill. And Mill is always in a weirdly positive place, and I'm always surprised that it doesn't see more play than it does. So Mill has essentially a bye in the Tron matchup, which is ultra popular. For that reason alone, it's going to steal a lot of wins. But it's also got just enough removal to be able to deal with the humans, the spirits, the merfolk, all that stuff that are just like lying around in the meta. And I think that it's actually going to be able to steal games off of a lot of people. So I'm actually going to stick it right here. It's going to go below black-red mid-range, but above humans, since it can totally steal some games, but I don't think it's going to be enough to get it out of B tier for now. It had its day in the sun, and if Tron gets a lot more popular, Mill looks great. But I don't know how popular Tron's going to be yet, so to be determined. So next are going to be our 5-color Niv Mizzet piles, and I think this might be the best positioned value deck in the format once again. With that said, there are a lot of decks that simply do not give a shit about value. So if you bring this to the table and your opponent's playing like Heliocombo or is it prowess, then you're not really in the right place. But I think this deck does have legs because decks like blue-white are really available to see play again. And I think those are going to be the matchups where this card, or rather this deck, can shine. Because it's got the Bringle Lights, it's got the Niv Mizzet itself, and it's got the ability to just outgrind really anything. So I'm actually going to stick Niv-to-Light all the way up here at the top of C tier, because I don't think it's got all of the tools needed to both have a Niv Mizzet package and remove all the threats that decks like Prowess and Spirits can bring to them. At least not effectively. But I think it's still gonna have some legs, and it's gonna shine in those control mirrors where, Niv Mizzet is gonna see 10 cards at once and Jace is only gonna see like 3, for example. So I think that this deck is gonna have a lot of legs against the slower matchups again. And here we've got Oops All Spells. And this deck is one that did lose an entire turn of efficiency from the Simian Spirit Guide ban, but has not actually been hard banned out of Modern like it was in Pioneer. So if you play this deck in Pioneer, I don't know what to tell you. Maybe come play Modern. But with that said, turn 3 kills are still really good. Like, you could still just kill people on turn 3. And I don't think that should be overlooked. I think I'm going to put Oops All Spells in like the bottom of A tier, because even if you have to wait a whole extra turn now, a turn 3 kill is still powerful, and this deck is still incredibly consistent. Like, all you need is 4 mana sources and a creature. That's it. That's the combo. And once you have those things, bam, your job is done. I don't know if I can stress enough how incredibly consistent this deck is, and how consistent it's going to continue to be, because literally all they have to do is replace Simian Spirit Guide with any 2-mana rock that produces the color black. Once it does that, game over. So our next deck here is going to be Primeval Titan, and here I'm kind of lumping in the Primeval Titan / Scapeshift piles, because I don't know which of the two are better quite yet. So I'm putting Amulet Titan and Scapeshift in the same stack of cards here. Mostly because I don't know which of the two is better, and they still revolve around Primeval Titan. Now, I understand that's cheating because I made a whole another thing for Aledom Call, but I think that deck's worse than these two. And I think these two are both fine. But I don't know if either of these decks are actually, like, good anymore. I think that they're still going to be definitely playable. And they are going to get people very dead. And actually, it's going to happen quite a bit. But I don't know if I can say that I think it's better than Oops All Spells. I don't think that. So I think both Amulet Titan and Scapeshift are going to live at the top of B tier. And I think they're actually going to stay there for a while. Not having the end game presented by Field of the Dead hurts these decks a lot. So if you can either take care of the Scapeshift or kill the Valakuts themselves, or just deal with the card Dryad of the Elysian Grove at the right time, I think a lot of these decks will almost cease to function without Field of the Dead. And that extra vulnerability is going to be a lot of why I think these decks are just not going to see the success they had prior to Field of the Dead being banned. So our next deck here is going to be Mono Red Prowess. So our Stormwing entity here is going to represent Blue Red Prowess, but Mono Red Prowess I think is still capable of being a very real deck, especially since people are going to try playing decks like Tron and like Primeval Titan piles again, that will open them up to your main deck Blood Moons, like the M. Hayashi style decks. And I think that Mono Red Prowess is going to have a real place in the metagame because both of those things are going to see play. And I think it's actually going to start performing a little better than Burn. Maybe Mono Red is not going to be quite as good as Death and Taxes, but it's going to have a lot of very real legs, and Blood Moon will mean that this deck will need to be respected once again. So look for this deck to be on the rise. So our next deck here is going to be Boggles. And Boggles, it's always a little extra medium, you know, like the deck's fine. It does things, it ignores opponents. But I think people are going to be prepared for Boggles to be a thing. With that said, it can still just straight up ignore some opponents, right? Like sometimes you'll catch people playing like Prowess or like Burn and you'll just get a Daybreak Coronet and that'll just be the game, right? But enough of those opponents are still going to be so prepared for you that you're just going to lose games. And of course, Boggles can lose a lot of games to itself too. And for those reasons, I'm going to stick it kind of at the top of B tier, or sorry, the top of C tier here. I'm actually going to switch these two. Because it does have, you know, it does its one job very well. But both being a deck that loses to itself and being a deck that may or may not end up actually being powerful in a land of like Hammer Times and Infinite Life and Oops All Spells. I think Boggles has game against the fair decks still, but not enough to ignore the combo decks and not enough to ignore the fact that your deck sucks sometimes. Oh yes, hi. So next is going to be my little baby, Spirits. And Spirits, we enjoyed a very, very good place last month. We were doing insanely well last month. And a lot of that's because we both just beat up on the Earl matches on the regular. And we had plenty of game against the fair deck since we had Shacklegeist and Skyclave Apparition. Until all the decks became Valky, and then we had a little game against Valky, but nothing had a lot of game against Valky, right? I still think, with all of that said, that we are still in a really good place in the meta, especially since like a lot of the top decks are no longer playing things like Ren and 6 and cards that body us, with the exception of Lava Dart. That still sucks and we need to watch out for that. But I do think that we are still going to be in A tier since a lot of the combo decks that could outpace us just lost their Simian Spirit Guides. That means that our Spell Quellers and our Skyclave Apparitions are going to be able to participate a lot more often than they were previously. For example, Oops All Spells now has to wait until turn 3, so they don't get to sneak in their, you know, their Undercity Informers under our Spell Quellers and things like that. Like, we get to actually participate a lot of the time now. So I think for that reason, we're going to be able to stay in A tier. We're not going to be at the top of A tier like we were last month, but I think we're going to still be somewhere middle in the pack to being the bottom of A tier, and I'm pretty happy about that. So our next deck is going to be the various versions of Stoneblade. And Stoneblade, I think, has kind of worn out her welcome. This deck has the ability to have a lot of legs, being both blue-white and Bant versions of Stoneblade. But I think a lot of cards that actively destroy Stoneblade are on their way back. So there's going to be a lot more people playing Lightning Bolt. There's going to be a lot of Culligan's commands in both Jund and Black-Red. And I don't know that you want to be playing Stoneblade in a format in which Hammer Time is going to be one of the best decks. So with that said, Stoneblade, the non-Stoneforge Mystic part of the deck, is still going to have a lot of legs, right? So you're still going to be able to play Teferi, Forces of Negation, Path, sometimes Snapcaster Mage or Spell Queller. You'll still have a lot of interaction with your opponents. But I don't think it's going to be enough to actually make this deck good. I think I'm going to stick it somewhere just above Mill. Let's switch these. There we go. I think this is where I like it. I like it less than Ponza, I like it less than Black-Red mid-range, but I do like it more than both Mill and Humans. So next, we're going to have Jace represent specifically our blue-black control decks. And the blue-black control decks are actually a lot better than they look. They did just lose Mystic Sanctuary, which is a huge blow to these decks. But I think blue-black is not as sad about that as blue-white is. Blue-white is just crying the saddest tears in a known universe because it can't just put Terminus on top of the deck with the Mystic Sanctuary anymore. But I think blue-black still has a decent amount of legs. And while I do think these decks are going to have a little bit of a hard time deciding on how to actually finish their games, I think I still like its position in the meta right now. Like, it does an okay job against most of these decks, but it actually loses to a lot of these decks, which I find to be absolutely hilarious. But this is where I'm going to put blue-black control for now. I think I like it less than Black-Red mid-range because it won't steal games with Blood Moon. It can't do that. But I think I like it more than Stoneforge, which is both a medium tempo deck and kind of loses to cards that are being opened back up to the format. Blue-black does not have that weakness, but I think it has the weakness of having subpar win conditions. Next up is going to be our blue-red prowess deck, and this deck, I believe, is nuts. Just Lava Dart taking care of a lot of the creature decks in the format essentially by itself, especially Spirits and Humans, is a great place for this deck to be in. Also, it just has a ridiculously fast clock, and Stormwing Entity is very hard to deal with. This deck is going all the way up in S tier. I think it is fantastic. Stormwing Entity itself is super hard to deal with. Basically you have to Path to Exile it or bust right now, because you can't Lightning Bolt it most of the time because the deck plays Mutagenic Growth, Gut Shot, and Flashback Lava Darts to escape Bolt range. You can't do anything with like a Spell Queller or an Apparition because it costs 5. And Fatal Push doesn't hit it whether you have Revolt or not. So the fact that this both provides a really crazy clock as soon as turn 2, and it escapes almost all of the removal in the format, that by itself is good enough to make this deck see play, but the rest of the deck is good too. So it's very low to the ground, very efficient, all of its cards do things, it can play Manamorphose for free, and that's great. I think Blue-Red Prowess is going to be very, very good. And you can sideboard into Spell Pierces and Flusterstorms against combo decks. What's to not like? So Snapcaster Mage is going to be here to represent our blue-red control piles. And these are going to include both Blue Moon, the Boilless Boil deck, and the Kiki Jiki combo control decks. All of those are going to file under blue-red control. And I think blue-red control is going to be a little bit of a sad face time place to be. Because right now, the important pieces of removal that this deck has access to are going to be all named either Lightning Bolt or cards that are much worse than Lightning Bolt. And by cards that I mean are much worse than Lightning Bolt, I usually mean like Brazen Bower, Jace's Bounce Mode, or Magmatic Sinkhole. Almost none of which actually like do their jobs 100% of the time. And a lot of the format's threats already don't die to Lightning Bolt. So like Lightning Bolt is kind of embarrassing against Death Shadow. It's almost worse against Prowess. It can hit Hammer Time, but like if they have a Sigarda's Aid, not really. Heliod's incredibly resistant, and it doesn't kill the key card here. If you play a Lightning Bolt on a creature against Dredge, they're probably pointing and laughing at you. And that's just the top 5 decks in the format. Having a significant weakness against the top 5 decks in the format is just not a place where you want to be as a control deck. And for that reason, I think I'm actually going to put it into non-foil Jund territory. Which kind of stinks because obviously automatic wins are pretty nice. I like Snapcaster Mage, but it just lost a lot of really big tools in the Mystic Sanctuary ban, and the removal is subpar right now thanks to the format opening itself up more to big creatures. So I just don't think Blue-Red Control is going to be able to hang. Next up is going to be Blue-Red Storm, and unlike Blue-Red Control, I think Storm is looking great. It is incredibly consistent. It lost nothing for the bans. It kills as early as turn 3 and consistently. And there's just really nothing to not like about Storm. I think this deck is just in a very good place. Consistency is exactly where you want to be in life. And when you're playing a format that's new and opened up and it doesn't really know what it wants to do, playing a deck that rewards you for playing, for knowing your deck like Storm does, I think that puts the Storm players in a very good spot. So if your name is like Hugo Freitas or Bryant Cook or Caleb Schur, this is your time. I think this deck's looking really, really ripe right now. And I'm actually going to put Storm just above Spirits and below Mono Red Prowess. I think I am really impressed with the way this deck looks right now. Because, like, it's resilient enough to be able to have game against Death Shadow. Baral's a 1/3, and that actually gets it out of a lot of the removal of Prowess. It does not really care about Hammer Time unless it dies on turn 2. A lot of the time, you can just remand a Heliod and not care about this deck at all. I actually don't know how the Dredge matchup works as Storm, but I have to assume it's in Storm's favor, because Dredge is like a turn 4 deck, and Storm's like a turn 3.5 deck. I mean, this matchup sucks, but like, this is pretty good. This matchup sucks, and so does this, but like, this is fine now that this is a turn 3 deck, and you have remands in your deck. So, I think I actually do really like Storm right now. It's got some extremely polarizing matchups, but I think enough of them are good for Storm to the point where you're pretty happy about being a Storm pilot once again. And next is a deck that has been kind of locked out of the format for a while, and that's going to be the Urza/Urza piles. And this is going to include all of them. So like Urza Thopter Sword, Urza with Underworld Breach, Urza with like just insert Grixis shenanigans here. I think all of those are going to file under Urza pile for me. And I think the Urza piles are actually looking pretty good right now. So this deck didn't lose anything with the possible exception of Mystic Sanctuary, but that's good enough to the point where I think this deck is still worth playing. Like, it has an infinite combo, it's got great threats, it's got a lot of good ability to play great blue cards, and the fact that it can combo without running nonsense like whatever the 2-drop Goblin is. You don't have to play that to get your Thopter Sword combo. You can just play a control deck until you get there and it's good enough. Or you can run it as a super turbo combo deck, and your opponent never knows until you're actually doing the thing. So with that said, I think I'm actually going to stick Urza right in the bottom of A tier, which is still a great place for a deck to be, especially considering that it essentially didn't exist last metagame at all. And now we're going to come to our last deck, and this is probably going to be a hot take here. So this is going to be blue-white control. And blue-white control, I think, is definitely going to be the best of the control variants. Like, Supreme Verdict is good, Terminus is good, even without Mystic Sanctuary. And I think this deck has just enough legs with 3, sometimes 4 main deck copies of Field of Ruin to get around all of the Tron and Primeval Titan decks. And for that reason, I'm actually going to put it all the way up here near the top of B tier. I think it is better than Eldrazi Tron, but I do not believe it is better than either Amulet Titan or Scapeshift. And I think it's miles ahead of regular Tron. Like, I think Tron sucks. But blue-white control is definitely looking to kind of grow its legs back, and this is going to be, I guess, our final tier list. So we're going to have a couple of very good, well-established S-tier decks that have kind of regrown their places in the metagame. We've got a pretty wide open and different pile of A-tier decks, so whatever your style of Magic is, be it fast aggro, be it combo, be it tempo, be it resilient combo, be it control, there's something in the A-tier for everybody. And I think that means that Modern is finally a healthy format again. So this is exactly what we want to see in a format, is your ability to play basically any archetype you would really want to play, and at least be able to get some wins out of it. Sure, everybody's pet deck can't be A and S tier all the time, but, you know, that's just Magic. But let me know what you think about in the comments here, whether you like your deck's place in the metagame now that the ban lists take place, whether you're sad about the metagames changing up because of the ban list. I don't know, say you're an Ad Nauseam player, for example. And I don't know, maybe you're Spirits and you're sad about Uro being banned. Whatever. Let me know what you think in the comments. And if you like what you saw, just make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see y'all in the next one.